Hello everybody, welcome back to From Rhythm to Algorithm, picking right back up with our derivation of sensorality. We were almost done. When the answer is going to present itself, I'm not sure. But last episode we touched on the mass gap. And now there's I think there's two types of mass gaps. An internal mass gap and a external mass gap. Again, we've talked a lot about how you have to differentiate from the inside of a system to the outside of a system. And a lot of our language is kind of like built around that. And so I just listed out a bunch of things that wouldn't exist, things that demonstrably exist that wouldn't if the mass gap didn't exist. And so now you have some sort of formulation of Yang-Mills and for a quantum theory. But again, remember, a scientist goes out into the world, consolidates all of his information, and writes a paper or formulates a theorem or a conjecture. And the operative words is what I base off of, because I can pick up all of the logic, all of your intuition in its entirety because of the consistency of language. So when you present Yang-Mills mass gap, I don't need an equation, I just need the terms mass and gap. Is there a gap in mass? Yes. And so things that wouldn't exist if there was not gaps in mass. And so the word in action of jump, right? If you make a jump, if you make a logical connection, if you bridge a gap, right? I bridge a gap. There's literally a phrasing for that. Sensorality bridges gaps. And so, like, that phrase wouldn't exist if there wasn't a distinct difference between the molecules in this system versus the molecules in my body. My notebook versus my body, both made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. But the protons, neutrons, and electrons in here are bounded. There's bonds. Between me, there's no bonds between the atoms in this notebook and in my body. And so it's relatively close. Like I said, I can eat and I can change my mass structure, but as of current time when you're watching this, my notebook, the molecules, the elements comprising my notebook are not bonded to my body. And so the word jump, when you're connecting two disparate ideas, when you make a jump or a logical connection, that phrasing exists because there's a mass gap. Right, another term is a leap of faith. A jump is a leap. Right, so if you have a leap of faith, right, I don't like that term, but the reason that phrasing exists is because of mass gap. Energy stabilized into mass. No physical process is 100% efficient. So when we went through our universal phase changes, and again, if you're on part 152 when you're not sure what we're talking about, the ball is in your court. You have to go back and watch all the other videos. But when you're stabilizing into mass, when we're going from a state of energy into mass equals mc squared, right now that we have, I put little arrows, but they're one way, right? Chronology exists. So it's not exactly that E equals mc squared, it's that R3 and R2, systems with two-dimensional components and systems with three-dimensional components interact directly. Mass and light scintillate, or radiation. Really got to stop using that word. But because no physical process is 100% efficient, when that stabilization occurred from the get-go, you couldn't have entirely condensed into mass. And so we have our initial energy density, and that consolidates into mass. In the same way we take a block, and if you chip something off the block, you can't get more mass in that initial state. You start with an initial energy density. Well, density is not really a thing yet, but you have energy. And then once that form starts to take place, you can't completely encapsulate all of the mass, right? That is why I can speak to you. The inefficiency, if physical systems were 100% efficient, everything would be silent. There would be no dissipated energy. You would have a state of entropy. You would have no entropy. And clearly physical systems tend to entropicity, I don't know, but see, I immediately started trying to derive off of those words. Meaning, the only way you could have, the only way that would be possible to not have a mass gap is if everything was if there was no entropy. So that's probably the biggest one, but it really stems from there's no 100% efficient physical processes. And so you would have zero entropy if there was not a mass gap. Clearly there's entropy, clearly you can move, clearly there's inefficient energy, meaning my vocal cords, we can structure that, I can put my vocal cords to vibrate in rhythm, and it structures into sound, and you can understand me. But none of that would be possible if there was not a gap in mass. And so the physical imagery I want, like I said, I'm 32, and so I don't know what year it was, probably 2004 to 2006, there was a band called Creed, and it was like this mud guy, like crawling out of the thing. Like, just go look it up, or I'm sure you can kind of get the imagery. It's a person made out of mud trying to crawl out of the mud, but he is the mud. And so that gives you a good image between an internal system or an internal gap and an external gap, because Yang Mill specifically gets at, the bounding of corks. But like, again, there's your fundamental stability of two. They're always found in three because you're in 3 dimensions. That's why that happens. But when the Yang Mill specifically is to an internal mass gap. So when you're thinking about that mud man crawling out of the mud, when his arm is like still part of the ground, but he has enough shape to have a forearm and an upper arm, and then his torso goes back into the ground, that hole right there, all of your holes in topology are internal mass gaps. So that's kind of like the imagery I want you to have. And then an external gap is the difference between the bonds, the molecules of my notebook being bonded, but not to me, right? We interact with pressure, right? This has mass, it falls down. I can feel it sitting on my lap because of the pressure, but the molecules are not sharing electrons. Whereas, and if you have an internal mass gap, they're sharing electrons, but there's still a gap within that mass. And so there's 2 types of mass gaps, internal and external. And the Yang Mills gets at internal mass gaps, but in complete generality, is there a gap in mass? Yes. And so, like when I'm sitting here right now, when I move, right, the pressure comes from me. Again, none of the electrons touching, and all of these little really small air molecules around me, right? Those electrons never touch, and they just push each other around. And so that's the pressure gradient. That's where you get temperature. That's where you get pressure. The pressure gradient is continuous. The actual individual mass systems are discrete, right? It's not particle or wave, it's particle and wave. And so because of discrete, that's what we talked about last episode, discreteness existing is because of mass gaps, right? The 3 shadows on the wall, that is because of internal mass gaps, whereas in the shadow in general, that it exists is the external mass gap. And so, right, if a gap is a break is a gap is a hiatus, discrete is distinct, a hole is a gap. And so what defines a complete dynamic? So now we're really getting to, after mass gap immediately comes, pretty much, again, you can solve Navy or Stokes or resolve it, because really all you're doing is describing the motion of water. You can start there, you can start with your physics, then get to the math, as opposed to start with an equation and go the other way. But really gets into, because you can very intuitively, anyone can understand the difference between internal and external systems. When it gets to the nitty gritty of the language, the actual words used, it gets that's kind of like the last thing you do, I guess, and that's what we're getting to. But you can see a tornado, right? You can see a hurricane, and you have an eye of the storm, right? So the eye of the storm is not within the pressure gradient of the tornado, right? So you have you can have, like, the tornado is a complete dynamic. That pressure gradient, or let's use hurricane, not tornado. So you have a very clear eye of the storm. So all of that, our Harry-Ball theorem, applying to vectors, a maximum and a minimum, that completeness is within the hurricane. And so the eye of the storm is not a part of the hurricane system. Hence, that's why the eye of the storm doesn't have any, it's calm, there's no wind. It's not interacting with the pressure gradient of the tornado, or of the hurricane. And so that's your physical intuition between internal and external systems. And so that type of process is the same thing that happens with atoms. They're just much smaller. But like you said, what defines a complete dynamic? That's our physical intuition. You know exactly what I'm saying. And then how do we generalize that to apply to any context? A complete dynamic, again, is just an electron that is internally bounded or bounded to another atom within the same system. Again, it's very clear that the notebook is different than me, but there's still a mass gap within me. And so, right, because you're mostly, I don't know what I want to say to generalize that, but it's very clear, again, with the eye of the storm intuition. So what is a bond, right? You're sharing electrons, right? If you're electric, if you're producing a current, right? My brain's producing a current, my whole body is not producing a current. So electrons move electrons, but if you're bonded with something, you share electron is the operative word they use right now in ontology. And so, right, sharing versus not sharing is kind of the difference between an internal and an external system, or what differentiates internal versus external. Sorality, bondality, what is the relationship of bonds and bounds? Another very clear linguistic relationship. You just add in a U to the word bond, you get bound. Bound are like what's at the edge of the universe. Very clearly, that's intuitively. It's like what do you say? Again, I've already resolved these things completely in speciality, which is a complete resolution. And so it's like, again, you have to do the most intense derivation that's ever existed, and then you prove it completely done, and people are like, do it again. It's like, God, okay, but geez. But what is the relationship of bonds and bounds? And so that really, like I said, completing that, whatever the curling, when I do this thing with my hand, is like the completion, right? Because we're linguistically completing a proof. And so if I'm missing any part of physical intuition, it's just because I'm at a different section of the house, so to speak. I'm renovating a different part. But very clearly, bonds and bounds. We just talked about a lot about bonds, sharing electrons, bounds. What is the boundary of the universe? Well, it's like we have a measurement bound. We don't know, right? That's something that's provably unknowable. And so, but you can still extend intuition to get to a point of completeness. We'll get there. We'll come back to it if it presents itself. But kind of like the final thing is, kind of the personal question, or everyone, right? What's the ultimate goal of life? Right? It's to be free, right? And it's a very physically motivated thing. Freedom, America, bald eagles. But you don't want to be connected to something else. And so that desire for freedom, like on a personal level, empirically comes from a mass gap. You being independent of another system. You being different. And so independence and completeness, those words existing, those phenomenon existing, that is because of mass gap. But freedom is really kind of the word that you get to. But sensorality is independent. So that was the finalization for the mass gap considerations. Now we're getting that, we're tying it back up with our axiom sensorality. Sensorality is independent. Energy is continuous, mass is discrete. It's not particle or wave, particle and wave. So that's the other thing. It's like think of the Creed analogy, the mud man coming out of the ground. It's like, okay, if that's the universe, if the mud man is the universe, how do you have the boundary? What do you do for the boundary condition? And again, like I said, I'm just missing something. I'm not going to try to derive something that I've already derived in completeness and then just butcher it. Just go look it up. Somebody stop committing fraud out there. But CMB radiation, not light. All right, that's our stability, our stabilization from R2 to R3. Does that indicate anything about the mass gap? Again, that's more so a remnant of the inefficiency of that process, right? You can't have more mass condensed than the initial condition of that energy state from R2. And so that cosmological microwave background radiation not being zero is proof and evident of these phase changes not being completely efficient, excuse me. And so that's probably the biggest one. Again, the state of zero entropy is effectively the same thing as the radiation existing. And so, those are huge physical realities. So the mass gap is another extreme. Again, like I said, all of the Millennium Problems are truly just trivial once you build enough intuition. What is the relationship between energy and information? Right, vibrational information is the thing, right? Vibration, that's our base. Information's our range. But information, we went through formality, in, normal, informal, normal. Something big is going on there. That's just ruminating in the back. But energy is information, right? The most general word you can categorize anything that would transmit some bit of knowledge or property is the word information, right? So energy is informative. Whether that's a mass, whether that's radiation, which are your only two options. We have a noun and we have a verb. But energy is without form, right? That's continuous. Mass is formation. Energy formless, mass formation. And so, which is evidently true, right? If you have a lot of energy in the morning, what do you do? If you tense your muscles, what are you doing? You're kind of like contracting them, make them more dense. And then mass is formation, right? Clearly, I have shape. My notebook has shape. The wall has shape. What's the shape of energy? I know what the shape of you is because of Ed Sheeran, but what's the shape of energy? Physically doesn't have one. QED square box thing. Literally like every jump and the final reductions, which is like the past 80 episodes of this. There's just proofs all over the place. But that is the biggest probably connection, is energy is information. Then getting back over purity, purify, an example of a noun and a verb in order, right? Because verbs are our base, verb, vibration is the base, verb is the base, expands to nouns degenerate into base, but once you progress, because of chronology, you can't get all the way back to where you started. And so, right, noun and verb, purity, for an example, a new example, purity, purify, right? The only difference in that word is the T and the F. Clear logically, purity, right? If you're homogeneous, you're completely pure. And if you're purify, it's like a verb to get to purity, right? So we have the same base, the logic, the only difference is the letter and it's a different form of word, noun and verb, right? So would you rather, just listen to these words out loud. Purify, purity, or purity, purify. And so like trying to show you why it's based on the verb in terms of order, structure of your words, and then again when you're iterating, when we're going back, we're deriving these axioms, we're going backwards. And so, but right, if you purify purity, the verb first, right? If I say purify, that's a verb. If I say purity, that's a noun. So purify purity, right? I don't know how to say it, but it's like direct. Then if I say purity, purify, like as a way to command somebody to do something. And I started with a noun, purity. You're just stating a noun. It's just like purity. Purity, what about purity? Purify. But if you start with a verb, purify, it's commanding somebody to do something. So it's operative. And so you start with a verb, then you go to noun. Purify purity. If you have a block of something and I said purify purity, you'd get that you're supposed to purge it. You're supposed to increase the purity. If I just said purity, purify, there's like a natural, you'd put like a comma there, or you'd break it naturally in conversation. So the correct order is verb, then noun. And we just exemplified that with the same base word, the same thing, in a new context. How does vibration relate to calculation? In other words, how does temperature affect measurement? Very clearly, the hotter it is, the more causes error in your equipment. But it's like, if I go, let's say the optimal temperature to record something with a camera is, I don't know, just making stuff up, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, because we're yeehaw American freedom, but 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So if I increase that 100 degrees, or if I decrease that 100 degrees, and I just picked 100 to start kind of arbitrarily, but is adding heat more detrimental than taking away heat? Can we generalize that to be applicable to all things? Probably, certainly, but we should have a definitive temperature affecting measurement, because measurement's generalizable to all physical interactions. Temperature is well-defined physical process or property. And then calculating is obviously measurements produce calculations. And so now we're getting to a fundamental physical question in known ontology, right? How does temperature affect measurement? Most people don't like it. Well, so I don't have a definitive answer, because I've had people say, their equipment works better when it's really hot or better when it's really cold, but can we generalize that entire statement to not have an arbitrary, point of melting or boiling point for a given molecule, but a state of vibration, right? Because all of our atoms are just different configurations of electrons, protons, and neutrons. Neutrons don't really exist. Electrons and protons have internal dynamic. They're just limited because of size. It doesn't really matter practically, but it's logically true. And so it's like, can we generalize boiling points, melting points, states of matter? I'm pretty sure we can. And just some sort of like vibration density or something to that effect. But how does temperature affect measurement? What is perturbation? Right? Science club on my first handwritten things. We're going to get to perturbation theory next. About 7 years later, now we're back. But to aggravate is to perturb. Right? So we define it in this context of emotion, our range, and then we can reduce that, degenerate that into motion. Right? Emotion degenerates into motion. And so aggravation perturbs, perturbation annoys. But if we take that again, we take that emotional form and reduce it to its physical motion form, we get our new axiom. And remember, we're reducing sensorality through the sensorality with an S, through sensorality with a C, to sorality with an S, completely defining sorality, soared in the past tense, because the past is complete. The past is definite. But what is, so now we can just have, right, sensorality. Now we can literally start looking at that word, sensorality, and all of these different forms we have, and how we showed that if plus normal is informal. Can we look at this word and pull out two different words? Same exact amount of elementality, syllability, same letters, and use every letter from the sensorality to form two independent words and show their bases, and then we can completely categorize sensorality and proving it as an axiom. Right, so sensorality goes down to soars. What is a soar? Right, it says what is soar, meaning that indicates a verb, a physical process, but now we're going from our noun to our thing. What is a sore? Right, if I have a canker sore, what is that? Well, literally, I think that's actually herpes. But what is a sore in general? A blister. What is a blister? Right, so what is that? Very clear, you know what I'm talking about now. That is sorality. What is it? Inefficiency, right? Illness, something like that. So we always have to connect it back to our efficiency axiom. Because nothing is 100% efficient, so therefore we can't have a complete cycle something. But completeness exists locally, something. We see all these pieces are coming together, we just need that final, definitive, stabilizing theorem. But soar, orifice, right? An orifice is a hole, but if you think the word orifice, I bet you have some ideas. But soar, orifice, right? So we have soar, ors at the end, or it's directly in the middle of the word soar, but now it's at the front of the word orifice. So we're just iterating this whole concept of sensorality to the point where by exhaustion, right? We're doing proof by logical exhaustion. There's no other letters to describe this physical process, literally. Like there's nothing else you could say about it. So that's a complete proof. Right? When I'm saying proof by logical exhaustion or brute force logic, this is what I mean. You do use intuition to get to this spiraling point, but once you get to these words that you know you're using, there's only so many ways to iterate those letters. So an orifice is a hole. And that is our final theorem for today, and I will see you on the next one.